The rain had been falling since sundown, and the fourth floor of St. Carver Memorial Hospital was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant roll of a supply cart somewhere down the hall. It was 10 minutes past 2 in the morning, and the intensive care unit was doing what it always did at that hour, holding its breath. Calvin Orry was updating a chart at the nurse's station when Diane Pollard walked over and tapped him on the shoulder without saying a word. She just pointed at the window across the room. The one nearest bed 4. Calvin looked up. He squinted through the low corridor light. There was something on the outside ledge of the window. Something dark and small, pressed flat against the glass. He grabbed his penlight from his breast pocket and walked over slowly, the way a person walks when they are not entirely sure what they are about to see. He clicked the light on and angled it toward the glass. 2 amber eyes stared back at him. The creature was roughly the size of a large house cat, maybe a little longer. It had dark greenish-black scales that caught the light in faint, oily patterns. Its wings were folded tight against its back, soaked flat from the rain. Its long, thin tail was wrapped around the outer ledge for grip, curling at the tip like a question mark. The face was narrow and sharp, like something carved out of old stone, and those amber eyes were watching Calvin with a calm, unblinking attention that made him feel, in a strange and slightly uncomfortable way, like he was the one being studied. It was a dragon. A small one. And it was, apparently, asleep, or had been, before Calvin pointed a light at its face. Diane appeared at his elbow. She looked at the window. She looked at Calvin. She said, very quietly, "Is that what I think it is?" It was not a question. Calvin said, "Yeah." About 11 years had passed since the Revelation period, when various non-human species had formally acknowledged their existence to the world's governments. Most people had adjusted, more or less. Dragons were known to exist, though the large ones were rare and deeply private, living in remote mountain ranges and ocean trenches and places where humans rarely went. The smaller ones were different, harder to track, more independent, scattered across cities and rural land alike. They were not dangerous, not typically. But they were not common either, not in places like this. Finding one outside a fourth-floor hospital window at 2 in the morning, in the rain, was not a thing that happened. Calvin said, "We should probably call Kevin." Kevin Sato was the hospital's non-human liaison officer. He handled situations involving non-human visitors, staff, and the occasional creature that wandered into the building through an emergency exit. Diane said, "Kevin fainted last month when someone showed him a photograph of a basilisk." Calvin considered this. He did faint pretty hard. He was unconscious for 4 minutes. They stood at the window for a long moment. The dragon had closed its eyes again. Its side rose and fell slowly in the rain. One wing edge was slightly ragged, the membrane torn in a long-healed scar that puckered at the trailing edge. Calvin looked at bed 4. Gus Merlo, 71 years old, retired ironworker, 3 days out of triple bypass surgery and still in a medically induced coma. His chart said no living relatives. His emergency contact field was blank. Calvin looked back at the dragon. He did not call Kevin Sato. Neither did Diane. They went back to their work, and the rain kept falling, and the monitors kept beeping, and the small dark creature on the window ledge slept through the rest of the night without moving. When Calvin came back past bed 4 at 6 in the morning, just before the day shift arrived, the ledge was empty. The dragon was gone. He leaned close to the glass and looked at the outside ledge. There, pressed faintly into the old exterior paint of the window frame, were 4 small claw marks. Neat and deliberate, like a signature. Calvin stood there looking at them for a while. Then he took out the small personal notebook he kept in his back pocket, not a medical chart, just his own notebook, the one he wrote odd things in, and he made note. It said, 4 claw marks on window 4. Small dragon. Soaked. Injured wing. Watched Gus all night. He paused, pen still on the page. Then he wrote one more line, "It will come back." 3 nights passed without any sign of it. Calvin worked his shifts, checked the window ledge every time he passed bed 4, and found nothing. He told himself that was fine. He told himself he had not been expecting it to return. He told himself a lot of things that he did not entirely believe. On the 4th night, it came back. The sky was clear and cold, no rain this time, and the window ledge was lit faintly by the city glow from below. Calvin saw it before he even reached the nurse's station, A small dark shape in the same spot, same position, wings folded, tail curled, amber eyes already open and watching the room. This time he could see it better. The injured wing was more visible in the clearer light, the torn membrane catching a slight shine. The creature was thin. He could see the ridge lines of its spine through the scales, each one raised like the teeth of a comb. It had not been eating well, or had not been eating at all. Calvin stood at the window for a moment. Then he made a decision that he would later describe to Dr. Priya Nolan as complete professional irresponsibility, and I would do it again without thinking. He went to the small break-room refrigerator, found the grilled chicken breast he had brought for his own dinner, pulled off a piece roughly the size of his fist, came back to bed 4, and cracked the window open 2 inches. He set the chicken on the interior ledge just inside the gap. Then he stepped back and went to check on the patient in bed 2. He was gone for about 20 minutes. When he came back, the chicken was gone. The dragon had not moved from its spot outside the glass. But it was watching him now in a way that felt different from before, less wary, more direct. Like something had been decided. Diane, arriving for the second half of her shift, looked at the window, looked at the 2-inch gap, looked at Calvin, and said, "You fed it." Calvin said, "I left food near an open window. What happens after that is not something I can control." Diane stared at him. "It was very thin," Calvin said. Diane pulled up a chair, sat down, and looked at the dragon through the glass for a long time. Then she said, "It keeps looking at Gus." Calvin had noticed that too. The dragon's eyes moved through the room the way eyes do when something is being carefully tracked, and they always returned to bed 4. To Gus Merlo, who lay still and pale and connected to 3 separate monitors, his chest rising and falling in the slow, heavy rhythm of a body that was working very hard just to stay present. Dr. Loretta Vance arrived early for rounds the next morning, as she sometimes did. She was a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and a habit of moving through the ward like she was always exactly where she meant to be. She found Calvin asleep in the chair near window 4, a half-empty bag of trail mix on the ledge beside him. She looked at Calvin. She looked at the window. She saw the faint claw marks in the exterior paint and the 2-inch gap at the top. She picked up a chart and began her rounds without saying a word. Later, when Calvin was awake and updating notes, he noticed that Dr. Vance was standing alone at the window of bed 4, looking at the empty daytime ledge. She stood there for almost 2 full minutes. He could not see her expression from where he sat. She did not report the dragon. Calvin noted this in his personal notebook without comment. The routine built itself over the following days. The dragon arrived between 1 and 2 in the morning. Calvin left food. The dragon ate. It watched Gus. It slept in short intervals, always with one eye partly open toward the room. Other staff began to notice. Pete Garland, an orderly who worked nights, started keeping the 4th-floor elevator door cracked during the coldest part of the night so warm air moved through the corridor and toward the window. Rosa Tapp, who cleaned the ward at the end of each night, began spending extra time on the window nearest bed 4, cleaning it until it was perfectly clear. Nobody talked about any of this out loud. It was simply a thing that was happening, understood by everyone who saw it, requiring no discussion. Then, on the 8th night, Gus Merlo's neurological readings changed. It was subtle at first. A finger moved. Then a slight change in his eye tracking under closed lids. Dr. Vance, reviewing the overnight data the next morning, sat very still for a moment before saying, carefully, that it was encouraging but that they should not read too much into it. Calvin read everything into it. He wrote in his notebook, "Gus moved his hand last night. The dragon was on the window. I am not making any claims. I am just noting that both things happened at the same time. And on that same 8th night, something else happened." Calvin was at the window, watching the dragon watch Gus, when the creature lifted its head and made a sound. It was not a roar. It was not even close to a roar. It was something lower and slower, a hum, almost, something that Calvin felt vibrate faintly in the glass under his palm before he consciously heard it with his ears. It moved through his chest like a held note. He did not think about what he did next. He pressed both palms flat against the glass. The dragon looked at his hands. Then it pressed its head against the other side of the window, right where his left hand was. Gently, the way something does when it is tired and grateful and has been outside alone for a very long time. Calvin stood there without moving until his arms ached. What the staff of the fourth-floor ICU did not know was that the dragon had been watching Gus Merlo for 31 nights before Calvin ever noticed it. It had started on a different ledge, 3 floors down and 2 windows over, where the angle was bad and the glass was partly fogged from a heating vent. Night by night it had moved closer, testing the distance, tracking the scent of the old man through steel and concrete and glass. It had found the right window on the 31st night and had not moved from it since. The reason was not complicated, in the way that the most important reasons rarely are. 22 years ago, Gus Merlo had been doing what he did most Tuesday afternoons, eating his lunch on a concrete embankment above the old industrial canal, watching the water go flat and gray in the autumn light. He had been 59 then, thick-shouldered and weathered, the kind of man who had spent his whole life doing physical work and wore it simply, without complaint. He had found the creature under the bridge. It had been very young enough that its scales had not yet settled into their adult coloring, still pale at the edges and soft in the way young things are soft. One wing was bent at a wrong angle, and it had been lying in the wet concrete shadows making no sound at all, which is what small creatures do when they are hurt and trying not to be noticed. Gus had not known what it was. He had thought it was some kind of unusual lizard, maybe something escaped from a pet store. He had not spent a great deal of time thinking about what it was. He had simply crouched down, looked at the bent wing, and decided that a bent wing was a bent wing regardless of what it belonged to. He had splinted it with a popsicle stick from his lunch bag and a short length of electrical tape from his work belt. He had pulled the beef from his sandwich and left it within reach. He had placed the creature on a warm south-facing ledge out of the wind, checked that it was stable, and then gone back to work. He had not waited to see if it was grateful. He had not looked back. The dragon had watched him walk away. And it had remembered. In dragon culture, a life debt is not a social formality. It is closer to something biological, a steady, low pressure that lives in the chest and does not ease until the debt is paid. The dragon had spent years looking for the old man, losing his scent across the city's changing seasons and finding it again, tracking him through neighborhoods and decades and the slow drift of a human life. It had found him at last here, in this building, in this room. And it had smelled, with the particular sharpness of a creature that can read the chemistry of the air the way humans read a face, that Gus Merlo was in serious trouble. His body was fighting. Some days it fought well. Some days it did not. The dragon did the only thing it knew to do. It came to the window. It stayed. Dr. Priya Nolan arrived on a Wednesday evening, carrying 2 equipment bags and moving with the slightly distracted energy of someone who has been excited for days and is trying not to show it. She was 41, a non-human biology researcher from the university across the river, and Dr. Vance had called her not to remove the dragon but to understand it. She set up a small bioelectric sensor array near window 4, non-invasive, aimed at the glass, and spent the first 2 nights simply observing. On the 3rd night she sat with Calvin in the quiet of the ward at 3 in the morning and explained, in a low, careful voice, what she was measuring. She said that small dragons of this subspecies were documented to produce a sustained low-frequency bioelectric field when they entered what researchers called a resting guard state. The effect on nearby biological tissue was not fully understood. Preliminary data from studies done in controlled settings suggested it might influence cellular repair in ways that were measurable, if modest. She said, modest, in the tone of a scientist who has found something that is the opposite of modest and is not yet ready to say so out loud. Calvin asked her what the field actually did. She said, imagine the body has a volume turned down very low. Something it does during serious illness, a kind of conservation mode. The field appears to turn that volume back up, just slightly. Enough to matter. Calvin looked at the window. The dragon was there, as always, its head resting on its folded forelegs, its amber eyes half open toward the room. On the night Dr. Nolan finished her first round of readings, the medical team brought Gus Merlo out of his induced coma. It was a careful, monitored process, and nobody expected him to be alert or responsive for at least 24 to 48 hours. But Gus Merlo was not a man who did things on other people's timelines. At 2:15 in the morning, Calvin was doing a routine check when he noticed Gus's eyes were open. Not the unfocused open of a sedated patient surfacing, actually open, tracking the ceiling, moving slowly with the particular deliberateness of someone figuring out where they are. Then Gus turned his head toward the window. The dragon was there. It lifted its head. The old man looked at the creature for a long time, the way someone looks at a thing they recognize but cannot quite place. His lips moved. Calvin stepped closer. Gus said, very quietly, "Hey, kid." The dragon made the low humming sound. Gus closed his eyes. Not the close of unconsciousness, the close of someone settling in for real sleep, deep and willing, for the first time in a long time. Calvin stood in the room and did not speak. In the morning, Dr. Nolan reviewed her overnight readings and went very still. She sat with the data for a long time before she said, to no one in particular, "The output increased by roughly 40% when the patient was conscious and facing the window. Through glass. At this range." She paused. "That is not supposed to be possible." She looked at the empty daytime ledge. She looked at the claw marks on the paint. She said, quietly, "You have no idea what you do to other creatures when you are kind to them." The complaint was filed on a Thursday morning by Dr. Clint Barrow, a cardiac surgeon from another city who had been brought in to consult on a complicated case in the room adjacent to the ICU. He had seen the dragon on the window ledge at around 2 in the morning while reviewing notes at the nurse's station, and he had stood there looking at it for a moment before turning around and asking, in a voice that was carefully controlled, who was responsible for this. Nobody answered him directly. Diane said she would find out. Pete was suddenly very busy with a supply cart. Rosa had gone to refill the mop. Dr. Barrow filed the formal concern with the hospital administration the following morning. It cited uncontrolled non-human wildlife contact with a critical care environment, potential infection vectors, liability exposure, and what he called a serious lapse in institutional protocol. The meeting was held in the small conference room on the second floor. Linda Cho, the hospital administrator, sat at the head of the table. She was 47, practical in a way that came from years of managing things that had no precedent, and she listened without interrupting as Dr. Barrow laid out his concerns in the organized, thorough manner of a man who believed he was obviously correct. On the other side of the table sat Calvin, Diane, Dr. Vance, and Dr. Nolan. Pete and Rosa were not officially invited. They stood in the hallway outside the conference room door in clean clothes, not speaking, just present. Dr. Barrow's case was not unreasonable. A wild creature on the exterior of a sterile medical environment was a legitimate concern. Protocols existed for reasons. The liability was real. He was not wrong about any of the individual facts. Calvin made the case for the dragon. He did not use complicated language. He said the creature had arrived on its own, had caused no harm to any patient or staff member, had not entered the building, and was visibly associated with the improvement of a patient who had not been expected to survive his first week post-surgery. He said Gus Merlo was now awake, responsive, and had that morning asked for a grilled cheese sandwich and eaten most of it. He said that if a therapy dog could be cleared for patient visitation and its presence documented as beneficial, he did not understand why a small dragon with a clean health assessment and a clear attachment to a specific patient was being treated as a threat rather than a resource. He said this without raising his voice. Dr. Vance added one sentence, "We adapt the protocol to fit the outcome. We do not discard the outcome to protect the protocol." Linda Cho sat with her hands folded for a moment. Then she said the dragon could remain provisionally, subject to a full health assessment by a licensed non-human wildlife veterinarian. If it passed, it would be given a non-human visitor designation under the hospital's existing framework. It was not to enter the building. It was not to come in contact with any patient other than Gus Merlo. Dr. Barrow was not satisfied. He said so. He escalated the matter to the regional medical board. Linda Cho thanked him for his time. 2 nights after the meeting, something went wrong. Calvin noticed it the moment he came on shift. The dragon was on the ledge, same as always, but its posture was different. Its wings were half open, not folded. Its tail was moving in a slow, tense sweep across the ledge. Its eyes were not resting on Gus. They were moving, tracking the room, the hallway beyond, the other windows. It was the posture of a creature that has decided something and is working up to acting on it. Calvin watched from across the ward. He left food on the ledge. The dragon did not look at it. At around 3 in the morning, the dragon shifted its weight. Its wings opened further. Calvin saw the moment the decision was made, the particular gathering of stillness before movement, the way a creature looks just before it goes. He crossed the room in 8 steps and pressed both palms flat against the glass. He did not have a plan. He had no idea what he was doing or whether it would matter. He just did not want it to leave. The dragon froze. Calvin stood there. His arms were already aching from the angle of pressing against the glass at shoulder height. He started talking, the way he talked to patients who could not hear him, not because it made logical sense but because silence felt like giving up. He talked about Gus finishing his sandwich. He talked about the rain earlier in the week. He talked about the coffee going cold at the nurse's station and the broken heating panel in the east corridor and nothing that mattered at all. The dragon's wings did not fold back. But they did not open further either. Calvin kept talking. He stayed at the window for 2 hours. His arms hurt. His feet hurt. He did not move. At some point, he could not say exactly when, the wings folded back. The tail stilled. The dragon lowered its head onto its forelegs and let its eyes close. It stayed. Dr. Cassie Ford arrived the following afternoon, cheerful and entirely unflappable in the way that wildlife veterinarians who specialize in non-human species tend to be. She conducted the health assessment through the window using a telescoping examination kit designed for large non-cooperative reptiles, and she did not seem to find any part of the situation unusual. Her written report listed the dragon as malnourished but recovering. Old wing injury, childhood fracture, poorly healed. No communicable pathogens. Temperament, non-aggressive. In the species designation field she wrote, small guardian-class dragon, probable long-term imprint bond, non-territorial in present context. In the notes field she wrote, this animal did not wander here. It came here on purpose. That matters. The hospital approved the non-human visitor designation 3 days later. Dr. Barrow's escalation to the Regional Medical Board was reviewed and returned without action. Pete, when he heard, pumped his fist once in the hallway and then looked around to make sure no one had seen him do it. Gus Merlo told the story the way he did most things, sitting in the chair by the window of his step-down room, wearing a hospital gown and socks with rubber grips on the bottom, like the story was about someone else and he was just passing it along. He said he had been eating lunch under the bridge on a Tuesday. He said the creature was just lying there in the shadows with a bent wing. He said he had not known what it was, exactly, and that had not really mattered because a bent wing was a bent wing. Calvin asked him why he had not reported it afterward. Why he had not tried to find out what he had helped. Gus looked at him like the question was slightly strange. It wasn't mine to know, he said. I helped it. It went on. That was the whole thing. He turned to look at the window. There was nothing on the ledge in daylight. There never was. Good kid, Gus said, quietly, to the empty ledge. The night Gus was transferred out of the ICU, Calvin walked past window 4 on his way to check the medication cart and stopped. The bed was empty. The monitors were off and pushed to the side. The room had the particular quiet of a space recently vacated, still carrying the memory of occupation. The dragon was on the ledge. It was sitting upright for the first time Calvin had ever seen, not lying flat in its sleeping position but sitting back on its haunches, wings slightly raised, looking into the empty room. It stayed that way for a long time. Calvin stood back and did not interrupt. After a while, the dragon turned its head and looked directly at him. Calvin said, "He's okay. He's going home." The dragon looked at him for a moment. Then it did something Calvin had not seen it do before. It lowered its head in a slow, deliberate arc, wings spreading slightly to either side, and held that position for 3 full seconds before lifting its head again. Not a bird ruffling its feathers. Not a creature shifting its balance. A bow. Careful, intentional, and unmistakable. Calvin stood at the window alone, and he felt something move through his chest that he did not have a clean word for. He pressed his palm against the glass one last time. The dragon looked at his hand. Then it turned, spread its wings, and dropped silently off the ledge into the dark air below. Gus went home on a Tuesday morning. Calvin and Diane walked him to the front entrance. He moved slowly with a cane, stopping once on the way to look at a bulletin board in the main corridor for no clear reason, the way people do when they are taking their time about leaving a place. At the front doors he stopped and looked up at the building. 4th floor. Window 4. The ledge was empty in the morning light. Gus nodded, the same way he had nodded on the day he walked away from the bridge 22 years ago, once, simply, like something had been confirmed. Then he got into the car his neighbor had brought, and he was gone. Dr. Nolan published a report 18 months later. It ran to 40 pages, and the scientific sections were dense and careful and full of the kind of language that makes important things hard to understand quickly. But there was one section near the end that people kept coming back to, that got passed around in non-human relations research and in hospital staff training seminars and eventually in places much further from any hospital. She wrote that she had asked every member of the ICU staff the same question. Why had they not reported the dragon when they first saw it? Why had they fed it, kept the air near its window warm, stayed at the glass with it, defended it in a formal meeting? She wrote that not one of them gave the same answer. They said things like, "It looked cold. It looked hungry. It seemed like it needed something. I didn't want it to go. It was keeping him company. It just seemed like the right thing to do." She wrote, "In 22 years of studying the relationships between humans and non-human species, I have found that humans are distinct in one specific way. They extend care without calculation to creatures they cannot speak with, do not understand, and gain nothing material from helping. Other species help their own kind. Humans help whatever is in front of them that seems to need it. This is not rational behavior by any formal measure. It appears to be something else entirely." She added one final line, which was not strictly scientific, but which her editor had encouraged her to keep. "Non-human species find this quality in humans baffling. A few find it frightening. And some, I have come to believe, based on evidence, find it sacred." 6 months after Gus went home, Calvin transferred to the day shift. On his last night shift, the evening before he made the switch, he walked the ward one more time out of habit. He stopped at bed 4. There was a new patient in the bed. A young woman named Claire Dunbar, 24 years old, recovering from a serious car accident. Her chart said she was stable but frightened. Her emergency contact was a roommate who lived 3 states away. Calvin stood at the window and looked out at the dark ledge. 2 amber eyes looked back at him. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to the break room and came back with a piece of leftover chicken from his dinner. He cracked the window 2 inches. He set the food on the ledge. He stepped back. He looked at Claire Dunbar, asleep in the bed, her face still carrying the tension that people carry when they have been badly frightened and the fear has not yet finished leaving. He looked at the window. The chicken was already gone. The amber eyes were still there, steady and warm in the dark, watching over the room.